All right, so he talks about at the very beginning in previous chapters, we talked about atheistic materialism, but that is not the only option out there. In many cases, the tools that he's given us to deal with atheistic materialism will also be helpful in doing apologetics with people who hold other worldviews. And he says we'll continue with the same technique, but with different questions and different problems as we approach these other worldview options.
Yeah, good. So, first one, this first section, he's labeled believers in a non-physical realm. He says the atheist has a materialistic worldview, but now let's talk about any kind of philosophy that says, we believe in mind and body. So this one is more than just the materialistic worldview. This is dualism. It's generally what we call this, where the philosophy says we believe both mind and body, that is in the physical and the non-physical. So this worldview believes that there is not only, just a physical universe, but also that there's a realm of ideas or a mental realm or a spiritual realm of some sort, not spiritual in religious sense, but in the sense of non-physical. So that's what we mean by dualism. So this world approaches it saying that there are two kind of ways that reality is about, right? Physical and non-physical.
Right. And so we once again return to our good friend Plato and his forms, and this is kind of the best laid avenue of that of someone who has an understanding. Yes, there is a physical world, but there's also this kind of non-physical world where certain ideas and forms kind of hold their place, and so that's what we're going to talk about here. So Plato did not believe that the physical world was ultimate reality. In fact, he thought that it was at best secondary reality, which on certain days I also think maybe that's a little bit more true than what we want to believe as well. But the physical world is always changing, and therefore it can't be the object of knowledge. For whatever it is that we know, it is unchanging, right? The thing that you call a plant is still a plant tomorrow. And so for him, there's a sense of plantness that exists opposite of that plant that's currently dying and shedding seeds
and changing,
and
right?
changing.
Exactly. Right. So as things are, the flux, the flow, whatever, things are flowing and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
so he says, how can that be a basis of knowledge when everything is constantly changing? So
Right.
there must be something that's stable that allows us then to have knowledge.
Right. I think kind of the quote that's most attributed to Plato that's probably in every graduation speech is the only thing consistent is change, and that's usually cited to Plato. So here's where it's from. Here's how we got that ultimate quote. But the object of knowledge, Plato says, is not in flux. But since the world is changing, then the ultimate object of knowledge cannot be in this world. It must be in another world, one that isn't changing, that is kind of separated apart from time and space.
Yeah, good. And so he says that we're going to move on to refute Plato, but we need to be aware that there are many people who would not call themselves Platonists, but who have the same basic problem, right? They want to say that there is physical cosmos, matter and motion, but they also want to believe in something like love or justice or fair play. And so under the skin, he says, they are philosophical brothers to Plato. They are dualists.
Plato says there's a realm of things like duckness or horseness or justice and love and triangularity. There are these kind of perfect things that if you were able to kind of go there, it would encapsulate everything that would be those things. So if you see a duck kind of in the world, and he always gives this example of kind of Huey, Dewey, and Louie out on the pond. They change. They might lose their feathers due to disease, but there's still something that is a touch point that we can say, oh, these are ducks because of this kind of idealized realm that we can point to. And so, in fact, everything that you think about, unless it's disreputable, like warts and other nasty things, so kind of the good, the ideals that we kind of the virtues that we think about. it has a form in that realm, that other realm. But in this world, in space and time, we find particularly like the three ducks, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, out on the pond. Particulars are in this world, where universals then are in the realm of this forms and ideal.
Right. So he makes this distinction, right, between things that are universals, like duckness, right? So we're looking at how do we know that this yellow duck is like this white duck is like this black duck? They're different colors, they're not the exact same duck. How do we know they're all ducks? Well, he would argue that they partake of the form duckness, and therefore we capture that form in these particular, individual ducks. So that's what he's getting at. So the form doesn't change where the particulars do.
This is the zoo that you want to visit, because this would be the best representation. So aliens abduct the best of the quality of each thing in the world and puts it in a zoo. This would be the one that you would want to go to, because you would look at it and say, this is the perfect duck.
Yeah. Even though you can't see and you can't experience that particular realm,
right.
It'd be nice to go to that zoo.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we deal with this kind of approach, right? It's not just the physical world exists, like the materialist says. This approach admits that there is a non-physical component of reality. So how do we deal with it? Well, we go similar right back to the kinds of things that he's already talked to us about, right? The question of how do you know, right? He says, now, what question would you be inclined to ask Plato? You always want to ask, how do you know, right? How does Plato know that there is another realm, especially, since we can't even experience it's non-physical, right? So he says, in fact, Plato works right into the apologist's hands at this point, because his answer, unlike what other less sophisticated people might say, would be, I've never seen that other realm because it's not open to the senses, but there must be such a realm. It's a rational necessity. So if there's no other realm like that, then we cannot make sense of our experience, right? And of course, that's the point, right? Okay, fine. So if it doesn't exist, you can't make sense of your experience. Well, that's a problem. So you don't know, you're just assuming, or you're saying it's a rational necessity based on how our experiences work. Is the way he would suggest that the Platonists would answer this kind of how do you know that world exists question.
Right. This is the guess and check. You have one side of the equation, and you really want the answer to be the other side of the equation, and so you stick the question mark in between, and you make up your idealized world there. Right. So the first person who refuted Plato actually was one of his best students, which was Aristotle. And I always appreciated learning about this, was that Aristotle was so antithetical to who Plato was, but viewed him as a great master and his teacher. And so it's really interesting to think today you wouldn't have this dichotomy between kind of a teacher and a student. You would have, this person is of, and we talk about it even within the scope of theology. These people are Van Tillians, and so they follow this one. But
so they follow exactly.
Yeah, and so it's just an interesting kind of point of view that back in the day you could actually learn from people who hold vastly different views from you and learn from them. So maybe the thing that helped build Western civilization, we could maybe slightly return to that just a little bit. But his response, Aristotle's response to Plato, was along these lines. What good is an unchanging form outside of this world? We never encounter these forms, these ideas. So how can they help us explain anything? In particular, how can they explain one of the biggest issues, motion? The most pervasive characteristic of the world in which we live is motion. Things move, things bump into each other. People experience that in the marketplace. Planets experience it with asteroids. There's motion constantly happening, even from what we know from a cellular point of view, is that those atoms are constantly in motion with each other. Even the table, even the book that you're holding, are just empty space that you're able to grab onto. But
Mhm.
in the realm of ideas, you have these unchanging blocks, as it were, of triangularity, of love and justice. How do they help us explain what happens in this world, especially one of the biggest components, which is what we said, motion?
Yeah, yeah. And so, Bonson points out Plato can't just say that there's another realm of ideas like justice and duckness and so forth. He must bring that realm of ideas into contact with the physical world in which we live. So, the key here that Bonson wants us to see is then how do both of these various worlds meet, contact? How do they interact with each other? Now, Plato knew that this was a problem. And so when he was pushed on how the forms inform the physical world, he said he didn't know and had to resort to a myth, Bonson tells us, a story, he didn't even believe was literally true, right? So, it's kind of like this, but it's not exactly like this. Right? He says that Plato said that Demiurge imposed the forms on the material world many years ago. So it's kind of like, a cookie cutter type of analogy, right? How does the cookie, how do they get to be the shape of ducks? Well, mom puts the duck cookie cutter on the dough, and there you have ducks, right?
Right.
So the cookie cutter analogy kind of is what Plato is using. Only it's not mom; it's the demiurge here that's doing
Right. Right.
that.
There's these kind of imaginary ropes of all ducks leading to this one duckness form, and it could lose a wing, but still that kind of string remains up to that touch point or something along those lines. This demiurge, kind of a almost trickster god, is the one manipulating these things and making good cookies.
Right. So the key here is that really the idea that Plato kind of gives up. He doesn't know. And so he kind of resorts to this kind of myth to try to help to explain it. But he really doesn't know how his particular forms interact with the physical world, right? He just doesn't have a really good explanation.
Right. Yes. So the greatest idealist uh, philosopher in the history of the Western thought didn't know how his forms and the particulars in this world relate. But you cannot have a worldview that arbitrarily says it's kind of like different actors playing a single role, or it's like this demiurge making cookies. There's got to be more to the knowledge than just I've made up a story.
Right. Yeah. All right, so that's kind of how he approaches this ideal of dualism, right? And notice the key question that he's going to bring up over and over and over again is how do you know? And that's a key question that he wants us to remember as we're approaching these various worldviews that are different from Christianity.
Hmm.
So he moves on now. Okay, we talked about Plato. Well, what about his student Aristotle?
He
Because
doesn't get he doesn't get
Aristotle,
out of it as easily.
that's right, he has a worldview as well, right?
Right.
Now, what Aristotle does is he returns us to materialism, is what Bonson tells us. Aristotle realized that Plato's attempt to bring ideas or class concepts or laws into his explanation could not be justified. Plato could believe it, but he couldn't justify it, and therefore he couldn't know it. And so, as he's already told us in the previous chapter, to know something, to have knowledge, the definition of knowledge that he's using here is that we must have a justified true belief, right? And so, if we don't have a good justification for belief, even though it may be true or whatever, then we can't claim that it's knowledge.
Right.
And so Plato understood this.
Right. So, as Aristotle said, I don't care about anything that exists outside of space and time. The only thing that is going to be helpful to us are the things that do exist in space and time. Then, of course, we've returned to materialism through, though Aristotle was technically not an atheist, even so, his materialism is tantamount to atheism or the atomism, and you can start dealing with it along those lines and to see where we get issues with just material world only. We can look at the past two episodes that we've done there.